Hi friends. Tonight, let me tell you a story, not of kings and crowns alone, but of hearths and homes, of the quiet lives interrupted by the tide of conquest. This is the tale of what it meant to be Saxon in the fateful days before and after the Norman boots landed on English soil. Over the next 20 parts, we will walk gently through villages, listen to whispered fears by candlelight, and feel the chill of change on the back of our necks. We begin in the year 1065, in a world still holding its breath. It was a mild autumn in the village of Grimsby, nestled within the old boundaries of the Danelaw, a region once shaped by the swords of Norsemen, now softened into Saxon farms and timber churches. The harvest had been fair, and the barley stacked high in the long barns that leaned like tired elders toward the earth. Smoke curled up from thatched roofs in the still air, carrying the scent of peat and bread and wool. Here, in the quiet before history turned its page, lived those whom stories seldom remember. Ethelred, son of Hrothgar, was one such soul. A yeoman of middling means, he owned 2 hides of land passed down from his grandfather who had fought under King Edmund Ironside. Ethelred's hands were thick with calluses, his back bent like the boughs of the apple tree behind his cottage, but his heart beat steady with pride. He had never met a king nor wanted to. The affairs of Witan and crown rarely reached the foot of his plough. His wife, Edgifu, rose early with the sun to tend their geese and stir the morning pottage. She sang softly as she worked, old songs in a tongue older than memory, and her voice smoothed the splintered edges of life. Their children, 2 sons and a daughter, ran barefoot through fields thick with stubble, their laughter brighter than the harvest moon. Grimsby was not a place of wealth, but it was rich in rhythm. Days turned on the wheel of seasons, sowing, reaping, spinning, dying. The bells of St. Cuthbert's rang for mass and for market, for death and for birth. The priest, Father Leofwine, was a kind man with crooked teeth and a deep love for ale. He preached often of patience and divine order, his sermons weaving scripture with stories of old heroes and saints martyred by pagan blades. But beneath this peace, a faint unease stirred. The death of King Edward the Confessor loomed near. He was old, childless, and pious, a king more fond of cloisters than courts. In the hall of every lord and the mind of every peasant, the question of succession brewed like storm clouds. Whispers passed from hearth to hearth. Would Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, take the throne? Some said yes, that he was strong and clever. Others remembered Tostig, Harold's brother, recently exiled for his cruelty in the north. And then there were darker tales of a bastard duke across the sea, William of Normandy, who claimed the king had once promised him the crown. To the folk of Grimsby, these were tales too distant to touch them. Yet, change is not a thing one sees until it steps through the door. One evening, as the sun folded itself beneath the hills, Ethelred sat by his hearth, sharpening a sickle. His eldest son, Cenric, listened intently as the old man spoke in his quiet way. "There's a shadow moving, lad," Ethelred said. "Not over our heads, but behind our backs. Feels like the world's shifting under us." Cenric, just 12, frowned. "Is it the Danes again, father?" "Nay," said Ethelred. "It's not a ship on the horizon this time. It's words, promises, and oaths sworn across seas. I don't trust them." At that moment, a low horn echoed in the distance. 3 short blasts. A call from the village watch, a signal of approaching riders. Visitors were rare, and nightfall rarer still for travel. Ethelred's face darkened as he stood, pulling his old sayax from the wall. In the village square, the folk gathered, oil lamps flickering like stars. The riders were king's men, draped in the colours of Earl Harold himself. They brought a message sealed with wax and haste. All freemen of fighting age were to be mustered by spring. The king's health waned. There might be war. Gasps, murmurs, one woman's quiet sob. Father Leofwine crossed himself. War with whom? Someone asked, but the riders would not say. That night, Ethelred lay awake, listening to the wind move through the shutters like breath. Edgifu lay beside him, her hand resting on his chest. In the dark, he stared upward and thought of his fields, of Cenric growing tall, of old battles long since sung into forgetfulness. He had no appetite for war, nor for the ambitions of kings, but the wheel had begun to turn. And in the days to come, Saxons like Ethelred would find themselves caught in its grinding teeth, not because they sought glory, but because fate, as always, makes little room for the quiet. The frost arrived in thin silver veils, brushing the morning thatch with the quiet breath of winter. By December of 1065, the land itself seemed to hold still, as if reluctant to bear witness to what was unfolding. And in every alehouse and mead, hall, the name of King Edward the Confessor was uttered more in worry than in reverence. In Grimsby, news came not from scribes or scholars, but from merchants and mendicants, their stories salted with fear. The old king had taken ill, they said, his skin pale as wax, his breath laboured. In London, priests lit candles in endless vigils, their prayers lifting into a sky that offered no reply. And all the while, the lords of England circled like wolves around the throne. Ethelred knew little of courtly politics, but he knew the scent of ambition when it rode the wind. In the hall of the local thegn, a man named Osbjorn. Rumours dripped like melting icicles, slow and dangerous. Harold Godwinson had been seen near the king's chambers. It was said he had sworn an oath, once in Normandy, but denied it now. William of Normandy would not forget such slight. And further north, in the lands beyond the Humber, another threat brewed. Harold Hardrada of Norway, a king with eyes fixed greedily upon England's shores, stirred his fleets from slumber. It was, as Father Leofwine murmured one evening, a season for crows. The Witan, England's council of nobles and bishops, prepared to meet. Their task was great, greater than any since the death of King Canute. They were to decide who would wear the crown, who would bear the burden of a realm balanced on the knife's edge. But in the village, life moved with reluctant obedience. Ethelred continued to till what little ground the cold would allow, and Edgifu sewed heavy cloaks to guard against the creeping chill. Young Cenric practiced with a wooden spear, as all boys did when war loomed. One snowy morning, a rider returned, bearing tidings. King Edward was dead. No trumpets, no thunder, just a cold breath and a simple truth. The village gathered in silence within the timber walls of St. Cuthbert's. Father Leofwine stood beneath the wooden cross, eyes distant. King Edward, he said softly, was a good man, a gentle man, perhaps too gentle for a world such as this. He looked not at the carved saints upon the walls, but at the faces before him, lined and young, worried and worn. The crown now lies upon Harold's brow, he continued. The Witan has named him king. May God grant him wisdom, for the wolves gather still. There were no cheers, only quiet. And yet, for a moment, there was a strange relief. Harold Godwinson was English, a Saxon, one of their own. Ethelred's shoulders eased slightly that night, his grip on the world less uncertain. But peace, as ever, was a fleeting guest. A fortnight later, as snow thickened and the wolves came closer to human homes, a second message reached Grimsby. This one bore the seal of Normandy. William, Duke of Normandy, had declared Harold a usurper. He claimed the throne was his by oath and by right. In Normandy, ships were being built, sails mended, spears sharpened. The tide was turning. The news did not come alone. Alongside it came a man, strange, pale-eyed, with a manner both courtly and cold. His name was Raoul de Chaumont, a Norman envoy, and he bore letters written in tight Latin script. The letters warned of retribution and hinted at mercy for those who would bend the knee when the time came. Thane Osbjorn, to his credit, burned the letter in his hearth. They may write their threats on parchment, he growled, but it is fire that will answer them. Still, the seeds were planted. Not all lords were loyal. Not all swords would be raised in defence of Harold. One night, Ethelred found his son staring out across the field, where frost glittered under the moonlight like fallen stars. "Do you think we'll be called to fight, father?" Cenric asked. Ethelred placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's not a question of if anymore, lad. The sea brings more than fish these days. But I've never held a real sword. Nor I. Not in years. But a blade is just a tool. It's the heart behind it that matters." The boy nodded, though his eyes betrayed 1,000 worries. In London, King Harold prepared his defences. Across the Channel, William plotted, counted ships, summoned men from every corner of Normandy and beyond. And in the longhouses and mead halls of England, the fires burned longer. No longer for warmth alone, but for war council, for oaths, and for remembrance. Father Leofwine began holding evening prayers daily. He spoke of St. Edmund, martyred by the Danes, of St. Oswald, broken in battle but remembered in light. His words floated through the cold like incense. "The storm will come," he whispered one night, "and we must decide who we are before it arrives." It was the beginning of the end for the old Saxon peace, not with a clang of battle, but with whispers and frost and footsteps on snow too soft to leave tracks. And as the days shortened and the world held its breath once more, Grimsby waited for sails on the horizon, waited for the sound of steel, waited for history to notice them. The frost deepened. By February, the streams around Grimsby had stiffened into glassy silence, and the breath of oxen rose like smoke in the bitter dawn. Winter, though beautiful in its stillness, had begun to bite cruelly at the heels of the villagers. But no one spoke of hunger. No one dared. For something far more pressing now hung over them like a shadowed cloak. The Fyrd had been called. Not just in Wessex, but across the realm, from the cliffs of Dover to the heaths of Mercia, freemen and landholders were commanded to take up arms in defence of the crown. It was not a plea, it was law. Ethelred received the summons in the form of a parchment marked with the seal of King Harold himself, though more likely penned by the hand of a royal clerk far from any field or furrow. The message was clear. Each man who held land must serve for a time or send another in his stead. It was a duty older than memory, older even than the language it was written in. "I'll go," Ethelred said without hesitation as he folded the parchment. Edgifu's fingers froze mid-stitch. "You cannot," she said, the words breaking the still air like a crack in ice. "I must," he replied. "It's not just duty, it's the way of things." She said nothing more, but the line of her mouth thinned into silence. Cenric stood by the door, fists clenched at his sides. "Take me," he whispered. Ethelred turned to him. "You are not of age. You are not ready. But I want to help. I can train. I can carry the packs, tend the horses." "You will stay," his father interrupted, more harshly than he meant. The boy's eyes burned, but he obeyed. Within days, Grimsby changed. The quiet routines of thatched roof life gave way to clamour and movement. Osbjorn the Thane convened the men on the village green, reading aloud the mustering orders and organising travel to join the local 100, the smaller military divisions of the Fyrd. The old, the infirm, and the very young gathered to bid farewell, their eyes wide with awe and fear. Spears were carved, swords retrieved from dusty chests, and tunics reinforced with whatever leather could be spared. Few had mail coats, those were luxuries for the nobles and household warriors, but stout hearts often wore thicker armour than steel. Father Leofwine gave a final blessing before the men marched, his voice hoarse from the winter air. "Go not for glory," he told them, "but for the homes that wait behind you." They left on a grey morning. No drums, no fanfare, just the sound of boots on frozen earth and the sighing wind. Ethelred marched with 15 others from Grimsby, farmers, thatchers, brewers. now soldiers by necessity. At his side was Wulfstan the miller, tall and sharp-tongued, and behind him walked young Ealdwine, barely 16 but broad as a plough-horse. Their path led them south toward the Burrs, fortified towns where furred units would gather before marching to coastal defences. London hummed with preparation. Every inn and tavern was filled with the noise of the army in making, carpenters shaping siege gear, smiths hammering blade and buckle, cooks preparing salted meat and oatcakes. Ethelred saw for the first time how serious the threat had become. William's forces had not yet landed, but word came like cold winds ahead of them. Norman scouts had been spotted near the Channel. Ships with unfamiliar markings lingered in harbours, and whispers spoke of Breton mercenaries and Frankish knights joining the Duke's cause. It would not be a raid. It would be an invasion. In the camp, Ethelred met men from beyond his world. A Mercian with a thick accent and a crooked nose who'd fought the Welsh. A priest bastard from Sussex who claimed he'd once drunk with Harold himself, and a Dane from York who sang songs older than the stones they slept beside. They trained, but it was not rigorous. Most of the Fyrd were not warriors, but defenders. Their strength lay in numbers, in holding lines, in standing between their homes, and the teeth of war. Yet even Ethelred could sense it. They were not ready. The Huscarls, King Harold's elite household troops, drilled apart from the Fyrd. These men moved like wolves, coordinated and swift, their round shields flashing. In formation, they were true soldiers, veterans of the Welsh marches and the Northumbrian rebellions. Ethelred admired them, but he also knew they were too few. Nights were long and cold. Around the fires, stories were traded like coin. "Do you think he'll come?" Wulfstan asked once. "William?" Ethelred replied, staring into the flames. "Aye, I think he already has." "But the sea's no easy crossing," said Ealdwine. "We may not see them for months." Ethelred nodded. "Or tomorrow." For in truth, they had no way of knowing. No eyes beyond the cliffs. No ships fast. Enough to chase the wind. They waited, and in that waiting, fear fermented like spoiled wine. In Grimsby, Cenric worked the fields in silence, each furrow a reminder of the absence beside him. Ardgifu grew quieter with each passing day. The geese wandered without direction, and even Father Leofwine's sermons turned grim. But there was still hope. Perhaps the Normans would fail to sail. Perhaps God would defend England as he had in times past. Perhaps Harold's oaths meant less than English resolve, and so they waited, on both sides of the Channel, not knowing the tides were rising, not knowing that Harold's eyes would soon turn northward, not knowing that while they watched, the sea, a Viking shadow, loomed behind them. The turning of spring brought no blossoms to the Saxon heart, only grim winds from the north. As March thawed the frosts of winter, England's gaze remained fixed southward, toward Normandy and the Channel shores. But fate, as it often does, crept from behind, and in its wake came a ghost, a brother banished and a sword long silent. Tostig Godwinson. He had once been Earl of Northumbria, brother to King Harold himself. But Tostig's rule had turned bitter. He had taxed too heavily, punished too cruelly, and cared too little for the fierce independence of the Northumbrians. Driven out in rebellion, he had fled to Flanders, licking his wounds and fanning flames. Now he had returned, but not in peace. Word travelled slowly through the villages, heavy with disbelief. Tostig had not come back alone. He had allied himself with Harald Hardrada, the war-hardened king of Norway, one of the last true Vikings in the old mould, a giant of a man. Hardrada had once fought across the known world, from the frozen wastes of the north to the golden cities of Byzantium. He had long claimed a right to the English throne through bloodlines tangled with Viking kings and ancient treaties. Most had dismissed the claim as distant thunder, but thunder, in time, brings lightning. By late summer, ships appeared on the eastern coast, not a handful, hundreds. Dragons carved into their prows, shields lashed to their rails, axes gleaming in the morning mist. The Norwegians had come for England. Ethelred heard the news in the southern camp near London, where the Fyrd still watched the southern sea. Riders came from the north, weary and frantic, bearing reports of raids along the Humber and smoke on the horizon. At first, the men doubted. After all, hadn't the real danger lain across the channel? But doubt soon turned to panic. Hardrada's army had landed at Rickhall and moved swiftly. They had crushed the northern resistance at Fulford near York, slaughtering hundreds of English defenders. The city gates had opened under the weight of terror. And alongside Hardrada marched Tostig, his banner no longer that of a Saxon noble, but a traitor's. The blow struck deeper than any Norman threat. This was betrayal not from a foreign duke, but from within the bloodline of England's ruling house. Harold Godwinson had no choice. He must march north. The decision sent shockwaves through the ranks. The army, assembled painstakingly over months to defend against Normandy, would now turn its back on the coast. Many questioned the wisdom, but Harold's mind was set. His homeland, his crown, and his kinship were all under siege. He could not stand idle, and so they moved. From London to York was over 180 miles, a brutal distance for any army, let alone one on foot. But Harold was desperate, and his men loyal. They marched day and night, sleeping in fields, eating whatever they could gather. Villagers stepped from their homes to watch the tide of soldiers pass, their eyes wide with awe and dread. Among them, somewhere in the 1,000-strong host, walked Ethelred of Grimsby. His feet blistered, his back ached, but his spirit burned. This was not the war he had expected, but perhaps no war ever is. Around him, the Fyrd murmured prayers and songs. Some wept, others laughed, as men sometimes do when standing too close to fear. And in Grimsby, Cenric listened to every scrap of news like a starving boy at a table. His heart soared with pride and plummeted with worry. Edgifu had taken to sleeping with a candle always burning, her prayers now wordless and endless. At last, the army reached Stamford Bridge. There, by the River Derwent, on a day that dawned, deceptively calm, Harold met his brother. The Viking camp was relaxed, confident. Many had left their armour aboard ships, believing the English still days away. They did not expect a king who would run the length of England to meet them with vengeance in hand. Harold sent envoys ahead. Some said he even offered peace, safe, passage back to Norway for Hardrada and Tostig if they would yield. But pride has no ears. The battle that followed was savage and swift. The Saxons charged across the narrow bridge, the morning sun glinting off spear points. A single Norse warrior held the bridge for hours, wielding a mighty axe and felling scores before being taken down, some say by a man in a half-barrel floating beneath the span. Once across, Harold's forces smashed into the heart of the Viking camp. Hardrada, great and terrible, fought until an arrow pierced his throat. Tostig, unyielding, died beside him. The banners fell, the shield wall broke. The Viking dream of England ended not in glory, but in blood. Only a fraction of the Norse fleet returned home. So few survived that of the hundreds of longships that arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the dead and wounded back across the sea. It was, in many ways, a miracle. England had faced invasion and triumphed. The Saxon spirit had endured, but miracles carry a price. The men were exhausted, their feet blistered, their shields cracked, their numbers thinned, and the coast now lay undefended. No scouts had watched the channel while the army marched. No horns had sounded in the south. For while England's finest sons bled beneath Viking steel, William of Normandy had crossed the sea, and with him came the true storm. The sea was a shifting god, calm one day, ravenous the next, and in the early dawn of September 28th, 1066, it bore strange fruit upon the English coast. At Pevensey, the tide curled in like a cat around the rocks, hiding the true nature of what it brought. But to the villagers who stirred in their homes, smoke already curling from hearths and bread still warm from stone ovens. The sight of sails thick on the horizon froze their breath. They were not fishing vessels. They were not merchants. They were warships, hundreds of them, fanned out like a murder of crows across the blue. William had arrived. The Duke of Normandy, bastard son of a duke and a tanner's daughter, had waited long for this day. His claim to the throne of England was, in his mind, righteous, sworn by Edward the Confessor years before, and secured, he insisted, by Harold Godwinson's oath. That Harold now wore the crown without his blessing was not merely a betrayal, it was a declaration of war. And William had come prepared. His army was not merely Norman, but a tapestry of Europe's hardened edges. Bretons, Franks, Flemings, even some exiled English, lured by coin, promised land, or kindled by old vengeance. They carried spears, swords, and foreign tongues. Their armour was finely made, their horses strong and bred for the thundering charge. This was not a rabble of raiders, it was a well-fed engine of conquest. The villagers at Pevensey could do little. Some fled at once, gathering children and goats, and prayers. Others tried to hide, only to be swept aside by the tide of men and steel. A few resisted, and were cut down. One old man who stood in his doorway with a hoe was trampled without thought. A woman who tried to bar her door was thrown into the street, her belongings scattered like grain in wind. William ordered that the beachhead be secured without massacre. "We are not Danes," he had told his men, "but war obeys no master once unleashed." Within hours, a wooden fort was being raised. Horses were led from ships, their hooves striking the soil of England for the first time. Fires were lit and scouts sent ahead. The Duke himself stood beside his standard, a banner blessed by the Pope, watching the cliffs with calm intensity. William knew Harold would come, but he also knew Harold was far away. And so, with cold precision, he began to unmake the southern coast. From Pevensey, the Normans moved inland, burning, foraging, and establishing a chain of fortified positions. They did not simply aim to kill, they aimed to choke the land. Fields were torched, orchards felled, churches looted not for blasphemy but for supplies, and where resistance stirred, it was met with fire and blade. Thens of Sussex tried to rally what men they could. Small third units, poorly armed and weary from weeks of uncertainty, attempted ambushes along wooded paths. But the Normans were too many, too well disciplined, and too swift. Their cavalry swept through the woods like wolves, flanking the English, who knew only how to fight in rows upon hills. In the nearby town of Hastings, word spread faster than fire. They've landed. Not the Danes, Normans. God save us. In Grimsby, the news came slowly, borne by a grain merchant who had escaped the coast with little more than the clothes on his back and soot on his face. "They've built a fortress of wood at Hastings," he gasped, "as if they mean to stay forever." Edgifu felt her knees fail beneath her. Cenric stood frozen, his mind alight with images of his father, of war, of death. "How long before they reach us?" someone whispered. Father Leofwine answered quietly, "That depends. Not on them, but on our king." But King Harold was still in York, tending to the wounds of a nation barely recovered from its victory at Stamford Bridge. When the word reached him, he is said to have fallen silent for a long moment before standing and commanding the men to march again. Southward this time. They had barely rested, barely healed. Yet once more, they would cross the breadth of England. Ethelred, whose tunic still bore stains from Viking blood, heard the orders as if through water. His body cried out for rest, but his will, like that of so many others, was iron-bound. He did not speak. He did not curse. He only packed what little he had left. The road south was no easier than the road north. Blisters broke open anew. Boots wore thin. Rations grew sparse. but the army moved like a great serpent, wounded yet determined. In the villages they passed, women stood in doorways and offered what they could: bread, apples, a kind word. Children reached out to touch the hands of soldiers, not understanding what they faced. In their eyes, these men were giants. In truth, they were weary mortals chasing a nightmare they could not yet see. And all the while, William waited. He trained his men daily, drilled them into perfect cohesion. His cavalry honed its charge, his archers their aim. He had chosen his ground well, a ridge outside Hastings, where he could dig in and force the Saxons to come uphill. He had not come to chase Harold, he had come to make him come, and all around him, the land groaned. For where the Normans walked, the old world cracked. The fields no longer whispered Saxon songs. The trees bore witness in silence, and the stones themselves seemed to remember. The air of early October was thick with tension and wood smoke. England, worn to the bone, braced for its third war within a single season. The land could no longer keep count of its dead. And now, once more, the Saxons marched. They did not march, like a glorious army. They were not polished nor splendid. Their gear was piecemeal, some with hauberks of mail passed down from grandfathers, others with boiled leather jerkins patched from old harness straps. Their spears varied in length and craft, their shields painted with fading symbols of protection. But they had one weapon stronger than steel: unity. King Harold led them from London with grim determination. He had not waited to fully replenish his army. There was no time. Every day the Normans remained unchecked. More ground was lost, more farms razed, more people displaced. He knew what William was doing. The Duke wanted Harold to attack quickly and without preparation. And yet, the king had no other choice. Among the 1,000 tired faces marching behind him was Ethelred of Grimsburg. His feet bled anew. His knuckles were raw. His breath came in short bursts when the wind blew too sharply against the hill roads. But he pressed on, thinking not of glory, but of Edgifu and Senric, of the geese he used to feed, of barley swaying in the fields. Along the route, the towns grew quieter, homes boarded up, markets closed, children huddled behind mothers who whispered prayers into the hems of their shawls. Though the Fyrd moved with purpose, fear preceded them like a herald. On the 7th day of the march, the scouts returned with word. The Normans had not advanced. They were encamped upon a low ridge, a day's march from Hastings, constructing wooden palisades and digging ditches. William, it seemed, was waiting. Harold halted the army. He called his thengs, his huscarls, and the leaders of the local Fyrds to a glade ringed by ash trees. There, beneath a pale sky, they debated into the fading afternoon. Some urged patience. "Let us gather more men," argued Leofwine, Harold's younger brother. "The Fyrd from the west has yet to arrive." "Each day we delay, William grows stronger," said Gurth, another of Harold's kin. "But each day we grow weaker too. We are starving. We are bleeding." Harold said little at first. He listened, jaw tight, eyes shadowed by weeks of sleepless nights. At last, he stood. "If we wait, more villages will burn. More Saxon folk will be driven from their homes. I will not be remembered as a king who let his people suffer while he weighed the scale of odds." A silence fell over the glade. Harold turned his gaze southward. "We march at first light." That night, the army camped in quiet reflection. Fires were low. Food was rationed. Some men sharpened blades. Others carved runes into their shields. Ancient prayers to Woden or Christ, depending on which god they trusted most that night. Ethelred lay upon a pile of bracken, staring at the stars. They twinkled with indifference, as if unaware that tomorrow might be the end of an age. Beside him, Wulfstan murmured, "Do you think we'll win?" Ethelred was slow to answer. "I think we must." The night grew colder. Wind whispered through the ranks, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant fires. In the royal tent, Harold knelt in prayer, one hand on the hilt of his sword, the other upon the Gospels. He asked not for victory, but for strength to endure what must be done. At the Norman camp, William did not sleep. He walked the perimeter, inspecting every post, every archer, every mounted knight. He too knew what dawn would bring, and he welcomed it. He believed the crown of England already his. He had brought with him scribes and priests, not only to record the victory, but to sanctify it. And between the two armies, silence stretched wide. No birds sang that night, no wolves howled, just the quiet breath of fate preparing to exhale. As the sun rose, golden and sharp, it cast long shadows behind the Saxon lines. The dew upon the grass was thick, clinging to boots and blades. The ridge loomed ahead. Senlac Hill, though none knew it by name yet, soon it would be carved into memory. The Saxons took the high ground. Harold positioned his men atop the slope in a tight shield wall formation. This was their ancient strength, a wall of overlapping shields, unbreakable by charge or blade if held firm. At the centre stood the king and his housecarls, massive warriors, bearing great axes with blades as long as a man's forearm. Ethelred found himself beside men he barely knew, but now trusted with his life. They did not speak. Their silence was a pact. Down below, the Normans formed into 3 columns. Bretons to the left, Normans in the centre, Flemings on the right. Banners flew high. Horses pawed the earth. William sat atop a great black destrier, his face hidden beneath a helm marked with a golden cross. He raised his sword. The horns sounded, and thus began the Battle of Hastings. The morning light on October 14th, 1066, crept across the Sussex hills in silence, brushing gold upon dew-drenched grass and casting long, thoughtful shadows from trees that had stood for 100 years. They bore witness to a dawn unlike any before, a dawn that would see kings fall and an entire age tremble. Atop Senlac Hill, the Saxon army stood still, lined shoulder to shoulder in disciplined rows. They did not speak. They did not sing. They simply waited, bound together in a wall of wood and will. The shield wall, or Sildwell as they called it, was the ancient backbone of Anglo-Saxon warfare. It was not elegant, but it was solid, strong, familiar. A tapestry of shields locked edge to edge, each one painted with faded house symbols, saints, or crude crosses. Behind it stood men drawn not from standing armies, but from homesteads and shires, husbands, fathers, sons. Ethelred of Grimsburg stood among them, his hand tight on the rim of his round shield. The wood had been carved by his grandfather. Its face bore the mark of St. Cuthbert, worn but still visible. His seax, short and heavy, hung at his side. He had fought at Stamford Bridge. He had survived. But now, staring down at the Normans, assembling in the valley below, he understood that this was no skirmish. This was finality. To his right stood Wulfstan, the miller's son with an axe nearly as long as his arm. To his left, young Eldwine fidgeted, his knuckles white around the shaft of a spear too tall for him. They all waited, and down below, the horns began to sound. The Normans marched in columns, banners flapping in the crisp wind. Their ranks were ordered with geometric precision. Archers at the front, infantry behind, and cavalry to the flanks. They moved like a machine. William himself sat tall upon a warhorse, his mail shirt shining beneath the standard blessed by Rome. He had not come to threaten. He had come to claim. The first volley came suddenly. Arrows whistled through the air, a sharp hum followed by the dull thud of shafts striking wood. The Saxon line flinched but did not break. Most arrows glanced off shields or embedded in the earth. They had faced worse. Then came the footmen, shouting in French, Breton, and Latin as they surged up the hill with sword and spear. The ground beneath them grew slick with morning dew, and still they came, disciplined and unrelenting. The impact was a sound unlike any other, a roar of steel on oak, of bone on stone. Saxon and Norman met in the press of bodies, shouting, snarling, grunting, the line straining under the sheer weight of force. But the wall held. Ethelred ducked a thrusting sword and drove his Sayax forward into the belly of a charging man whose shield bore the emblem of a lion. Blood sprayed across his tunic. Wulfstan beside him roared with exertion, swinging his axe in wide arcs that tore through chainmail and flesh alike. Ealdwine's spear found a thigh, and he stumbled backward as the wounded soldier crashed to the ground. The boy looked as if he might vomit, but he stayed standing. That alone was victory. The first charge was repelled. Cheers rose briefly from the Saxon lines, short, grim acknowledgements of survival. They barely had time to breathe before the next wave came. This time, it was the cavalry. The Norman knights spurred their destriers uphill. The horses, trained for war, barreled toward the shield wall with terrifying speed, their riders leaning forward with lances poised. The ground trembled beneath the hooves. Ethelred dug in his heels. The charge crashed like thunder against the Saxon ranks. The shields groaned under the force. Men were thrown backward, trampled, crushed. Yet again, the wall, battered and splintered, held. Axes came down like hammers on helmeted heads. Spears flashed. Swords bit through exposed necks. The press of the fight was constant, airless, smothering. Somewhere down the line, a shout. They flee! The Bretons flee! It was true. The Norman left flank had begun to break. Bretons turned and ran, tripping over the bodies of their own dead as they tried to escape. A roar of triumph rose among the Saxons, but triumph is often the mask of ruin. Harold shouted for his men to hold position. "Stay! Hold the line!" he bellowed. Not all heard, or perhaps they simply could not resist. A cluster of inexperienced fyrd broke ranks and pursued the retreating Normans down the hill. It was what William had hoped for. The retreat had been a ruse. Once the Saxons reached the valley, the Norman cavalry turned on them with brutal efficiency, encircling and slaughtering them. The English screamed as the trap closed, and the hill drank the blood of the brave and the reckless. Ethelred watched in horror. The hole in the line gaped wide. Panic fluttered, unspoken but real. He gritted his teeth and relocked his shield against Wulfstan's. "They must not break us," he said through clenched teeth. The sun rose higher. The mud grew slicker. The cries of the dying filled the air. Still, the Saxons stood. Still, the wall held. But the day was only beginning, and the weight of it had only just begun to press down. By the time the sun reached its peak above Senlac Hill, the rhythm of battle had begun to falter. It was no longer the deliberate, determined cadence of shield against shield, of axe against mail, of heartbeats steady in unison. Now it was chaos, creeping in, small at first, like a hairline crack along a church wall, and then widening, splintering the symmetry that had held the Saxon line together since morning. Ethelred could feel it. Not in any one thing, but in everything. The slight disjoint in the man beside him who failed to step forward in time, the gap a few feet down the line where two bodies had fallen and no one had moved to fill their space, the eerie silence after each wave of Norman, arrows where once the Saxons had shouted oaths or encouragement. The silence was not peace. It was fatigue. It was fear, settling into bone. He blinked against the sweat dripping from his brow, his vision swimming with dust and sunlight. His shield, heavy and cracked at the top rim, felt like a tree trunk strapped to his arm. His Sayax, once bright with care, was dull now with blood, most of it not his own. Wulfstan beside him was breathing heavily. Blood clung to his tunic, matted into his beard, and a nick along his jaw pulsed with each heartbeat. He said nothing, not even in jest. Earlier in the morning, he had joked between blows. Now his lips were set in a line of grim, bitter resolve. They had watched young Ealdwine fall 2 hours before. The boy had cried out once, pierced in the thigh by a stray arrow, then dragged backward into the crush of bodies and lost from view. Whether he still lived, neither man could say, but neither dared to break formation to find him. The shield wall demanded sacrifice. All morning it had held. Wave after wave, the Normans had come. Infantry, archers, mounted knights, and each time they had been repelled. The Saxons had stood their ground, just as they had at Stamford Bridge, just as their fathers had done in wars past. But now the day was different. Now the sun hung high and uncaring. Now the Norman arrows came in, arcs instead of lines, falling not into shields but behind them, aimed at the heads of men too tired to raise arms. Harold's orders to hold firm were met with weary nods, not the affirming clatter of spears to shields. Still, they stood. The battlefield stank of iron and fire and rot. Buzzing flies were already gathering over the heaps of bodies that tumbled. Down the slopes, Norman, Saxon, all the same in death. The cries of the wounded punctuated the wind like bells at a funeral. Ethelred's mind wandered. He thought of home, of the tiny window in his cottage where sunlight filtered in on cold mornings, of Edgifu kneeling by the hearth, stoking the embers, of Cenric carving his first sling from the twisted limb of a fallen yew. He wondered if they were thinking of him too. He did not wonder if he would survive. That was no longer a question he allowed. To his right, the line shook. A group of ferdmen, villagers, and farmers, poorly armed but fiercely loyal, had begun to waver. They had seen what looked like another Norman retreat, and some of them surged forward without orders, believing the end was near. But the Normans had done this before, and like before, they turned with discipline and struck hard, cutting down the scattered Saxons in the open field. It was a trap, rehearsed, deliberate. The line contracted to seal the breach, but every gap cost blood. Harold, atop the hill, saw the chaos and cried out for them to hold position, to stay behind the wall, to remain unified. His voice echoed above the carnage, but desperation had begun to seep in like cold through a cracked window. And then came the horses. Once again, the Norman cavalry charged the ridge, their lances lowered, their horses snorting with foam and rage. The ground trembled with the rhythm of hooves, and the sound of their advance was a drumbeat of death. Ethelred locked his stance. He braced his shield against his shoulder and prayed, not to any saint in particular, but to whatever gods might still be listening. Wulfstan beside him mirrored the motion. The charge struck with ferocity. The shields groaned under the pressure. Ethelred felt the breath rush from his chest as a lance hit square against his shield, throwing him back a step. The man next to him fell, a blade buried in his collarbone, blood spraying into the air like wine. Still they held. Axes chopped at horse legs, spears jabbed beneath armoured plates. Riders fell, some screamed, some made no sound at all. When the cavalry withdrew, they left behind carnage, but not victory. The Saxon wall, though bruised and battered, still stood. But it was thinner now, quieter, and with each wave, the men became slower to rise. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the hill. The heat gave way to cool air, and with it, the aching sting of sweat drying on open wounds. Yet the Normans, unrelenting, circled again. Ethelred slumped against his shield, his fingers numb. Wulfstan sat down beside him briefly, just long enough to exhale. "They'll come again soon," he murmured. Ethelred nodded. "Aye, and again, after that." They said nothing else. In the quiet, Ethelred could almost hear birdsong, imagined perhaps from another place, another day. He wondered how the hill would look tomorrow, empty of armies, filled only with crows. And yet, for now, he stood, not because he hoped, but because others still stood with him. By the time the shadows of men stretched long across the bloody slopes of Senlac Hill, The battle had entered its slow, agonizing final act. The rhythm of war was now a crawl, a groan, a whisper. The Saxons were still standing, but no longer as they had that morning. There were no roars of defiance now, no drums of discipline in their boots. The shield wall had become a ragged lattice of dying resolve, held together not by formation, but by stubbornness, by memory, by sheer ghostly will. Ethelred stood still, his feet planted in a soup of blood and churned soil. He was barely upright. His shield had long since cracked in half. His right hand gripped a spear, not his own, plucked from the ground when his sayax had been lost hours earlier during one of the Norman feints. His left arm hung useless. A jagged gash ran along his forearm, too deep to bind, too shallow to kill him swiftly. He had not seen Wulfstan in nearly an hour. One moment, the miller's son had been beside him, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward. The next, a clash, a shove, a roar, and Wulfstan was gone into the tide of men. Ethelred had not dared to search. He would not find him among the living. What now remained on the hill were husks of warriors, shells of those who had once sung together in mead halls, who had laughed by firelight, men who no longer spoke, because words required energy that no longer existed. Yet they stood, because they must. Harold was still alive. Word passed through the ranks, brittle as parchment. The king holds the line. He and his housecarls remained, atop the hill's crest, their great two-handed axes cleaving through mounted knights like lumber through rotten wood. Each swing was a prayer, each breath a rebellion. The Norman duke, too, had begun to feel the cost of his ambition. His once pristine army was now bloodied and fragmented. Hundreds lay dead along the slope. Horses screamed and thrashed as arrows pierced their flanks. The Bretons, who had nearly fled in the morning, now fought with bitter mouths and wide eyes, as if trapped in something far older and deeper than war. William, the bastard duke, had been unhorsed at least once during the battle, yet he fought on, tireless, determined, commanding with a sword drawn high and a voice hoarse with urgency. This was not a man content to leave without a crown. The sky had begun to change. The bright blue of morning had turned into the golden dim of late afternoon, the kind of light that softened the world, that touched the edges of death with a cruel sort of beauty. Ethelred noticed it as a shaft of sunlight pierced the thick smoke, illuminating the bent helm of a dead housecarl. A crow had already landed, nearby. Its beady eyes watched him without fear. He did not know what hour it was. He only knew it could not go on much longer. The next Norman assault came with fresh fury. William ordered every remaining unit forward, archers to soften the line, foot soldiers to press the gaps, cavalry to break the last defences. They came not like soldiers, but like a tide of inevitability. The arrows fell once more, and Ethelred raised his broken shield out of habit, rather than hope. One shaft grazed his thigh, another lodged into the wood. A third struck the man behind him in the throat. He fell like a sack of oats, his eyes still blinking. Ethelred did not turn. He could not afford to. Then the melee was upon them again. Swords crashed into shields that no longer had edges. Spears glanced off helms that were already dented beyond repair. Cries of pain were softer now. Most who fell made no sound at all. Ethelred ducked beneath a swing, drove his spear upward, and felt the weight of it catch something soft. A Norman fell forward into him, knocking him to his knees. Blood soaked his legs. His vision narrowed. He pushed the body away, stood again with trembling limbs, and braced once more. Behind him, someone was screaming for the king, and then, like a knife slipped beneath the ribs of history, it happened. A single arrow, loosed by a Norman archer, some say at random, others say by command, found its mark. It struck Harold. Accounts differ. Some say it pierced his eye, others that he was cut down by a cavalryman after falling. But the effect was the same. the King of England fell. A silence spread, not immediate, but creeping, like a shadow cast by clouds over hills. It passed from man to man. Not all heard the news at once, but in the line, something intangible gave way. Ethelred felt it, as if the very spine of the army had snapped. The shield wall, still partially intact, sagged. Some men continued fighting, some turned, some sank to their knees. But the line was no longer a wall, it was a memory. Ethelred did not run. He did not kneel. He simply remained where he stood, surrounded by bodies, friends, strangers, enemies. Above, the sky had begun to burn gold and rose. He thought of Grimsby, of geese in the mist, of his son's hand in his. Then he stepped forward once more into the sea of steel. The sun had nearly vanished when the last cry faded from Senlac Hill, where once thousands of men had stood, vibrant, defiant, armed with pride and purpose. Now there was only stillness and silence. A heavy, humming silence that felt less like peace and more like the hush that follows a scream too loud for the ears to carry. The Saxons were broken, not in the way a man is broken when wounded, but in the way a tree falls and its roots are torn out from the earth. Something old had died upon that hill, something that had stood for centuries, the very soul of England as it had been known, an island of kinship, of local lords, of ancient customs stretching back to Alfred and beyond. Now it lay buried beneath mail-clad bodies, beneath banners torn to ribbons, beneath the dying breaths of men who had believed, perhaps foolishly, that their land could remain untouched. Among the few still living, Ethelred crawled from beneath the slumped corpse of a Norman knight. He did not remember the blow that had knocked him flat. Only the sudden darkness, the weight, the press of blood. His ears rang with a high, constant whine. His hands were sticky and red, though he no longer knew from whose veins the blood came. All around him lay ruin. The Saxon shield wall, so proud, so determined, was now only fragments of men. Some folded in upon themselves like broken tools, others twisted into grotesque shapes that defied recognition. The king's standard had vanished, trampled into the churned ground. And where Harold had once stood, only a tangle of limbs and blood remained. Ethelred forced himself to his knees. His breath came in shudders. He looked for familiar faces and found none. No Wulfstan, no Eldwine, just ghosts. The Normans had begun to sweep the field, not to finish the battle, for it was over, but to secure their victory. They moved methodically, with the discipline of farmers reaping a harvest. Some looted, some put wounded Saxons to the sword, sparing no time for mercy. Others simply watched the sun sink lower, their faces unreadable beneath steel helms. Ethelred did not wait to be found. He crawled at first, then stumbled to his feet, moving with the shambling gait of a man caught between the living and the dead. He limped down the far side of the hill, away from the Norman host, toward the trees where the archers had once stood. No one noticed him, or perhaps they did, but deemed him too near death to matter. The woods swallowed him. There, beneath the dark canopy, he fell again, not from injury this time, but from grief, from exhaustion, from the sudden understanding that everything he had fought to protect was gone. For hours he lay among the roots of an old oak, listening to the forest reclaim its quiet. Eventually, the stars began to blink awake above the treetops. In the distance, firelight flickered on the hill. The Normans were making camp atop the corpses. The next day dawned chill and colourless. Ethelred rose slowly, his joints stiff, his wounds crusted, but still weeping. He did not know how far it was to Grimsby. He only knew that he had to go. He walked with no food, no water, no weapon, just the memory of why he had marched south in the first place. 2 days passed, perhaps 3. He slept beneath hedgerows, drank from streams, hid from Norman patrols moving deeper into the countryside. Once, he saw a village burning in the distance and veered away. When at last he reached the borders of Grimsby, it was dusk again. The fields looked as he had left them, empty but whole. The geese were still in the yard. The smoke still rose from chimneys. The church bell rang once, solemn and slow. And there, in the doorway of his cottage, stood Edgifu. She did not cry out when she saw him. She did not run. She simply walked to him, touched his cheek with trembling fingers, and said, "You came back." Cenric ran from behind her, flinging his arms around his father's waist, and Ethelred, who had stood against Norman steel, who had buried friends without ceremony, who had felt the kingdom fall beneath his feet, let his knees finally buckle. He wept, not for himself, not for the pain, but for the world that had passed in silence, like the setting of a sun. That night, as he lay in his bed with Eadgifu's hand in his and Cenric curled beside him, Ethelred dreamed of St. Cuthbert. In the dream, the saint stood upon a hill covered not in bodies, but in wildflowers. He said nothing. He only looked at Ethelred with quiet eyes, as if to say, "You lived. Remember what must not be forgotten." In the morning, the crows returned. They did not speak Latin or Norman French, but they understood the shape of endings and the taste of what came after. The first days after Hastings were quiet in Grimsby, but it was not a comforting quiet. It was the silence that follows a storm when the sky is still unsure whether it has finished breaking. The village lived in a half-light of unknowing, caught between mourning and dread. Ethelred did not speak of the battle. When Father Leofwine gently asked, he shook his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "Let the ground settle first." The villagers honoured him with their eyes. No one called him a hero. No one needed to. The way he walked, slower now, with a limp that would never leave, told them all they needed to know. He had seen what they feared. He had come back changed. Edgifu nursed him without question. Her hands were gentle, but her eyes were sharper now, more watchful. Cenric stayed close, always close, carrying water, fetching firewood, hovering by the door when Ethelred sat alone. For a time, it seemed the world might hold. But then, one morning, the sound of hooves echoed along the lane. Not the easy clop of a farmer's cart, but the clipped, deliberate beat of soldiers. Grimsby turned to look and saw the beginning of a new age arrive. There were 6 of them, mounted, armoured, draped in blue and gold with polished helms that gleamed in the autumn light. Their leader was a tall man with a narrow face and a scar along his cheek that looked like a misplaced smile. He did not dismount. He did not introduce himself. He simply announced in French-tinged English, "By order of His Grace, William, Duke of Normandy and rightful King of England, this village is now under Norman protection." There was no applause, only wind in the trees. Ethelred stepped forward. "We've seen no fighting here," he said cautiously. "We are peaceful folk, no threat to your king." The scarred man looked down at him, amused. "It is not your peace we question," he replied. "It is your obedience." He handed a scroll to Father Leofwine, who unrolled it slowly. It was a writ stamped with wax and Latin. The words, once translated, were clear. All lands, all tithes, and all rights once held by Saxon thegns or freemen were now subject to Norman re-evaluation. Those who could not prove rightful claim would forfeit property. All churches must now include the name of William in their prayers. All villages must tithe a portion of their harvest to the new lord who would soon be appointed. The soldiers did not linger long. They took nothing, yet. But before they left, they marked the door of Osbjorn's hall with chalk, a symbol, a claim. They would return. That night, the village did not sleep easily. Folk gathered in the church, candles flickering, prayers rising in hushed tones. Some still clung to hope that this was temporary, that the new king might rule from afar. that villages like Grimsby would be too small to matter. But Ethelred knew better. "They will not forget us," he said. "They never forget what they believe they own." Over the next days, new patterns took root. A man in Norman livery came to stay, not a soldier, but a scribe, pale, quiet, quick with ink and questions. He recorded the number of pigs, chickens, bushels of grain. He asked for names, ages, marriages, births, deaths. The villagers called him the Shadow. He wrote without looking up. Then came the taxes. For the first time in memory, coin was demanded in place of labour or goods. Few had any. Silver pennies were rare in Grimsby, passed only in trade with distant markets. When some could not pay, the soldiers returned. Not with fire, not yet, but they took tools, livestock, a wagon. Even Osbeorn's eldest son was taken as a bonded servant, to repay the debt, they said. No one resisted, not openly. The memory of Hastings still clung to them like frost. Father Leofwine preached, restraint, patience. "It is not the sword that endures," he said. "It is the root, the seed." But in the eyes of the young, like Cenric, anger began to take shape. One night he spoke softly to Ethelred as they sat by the dying hearth. "We could fight, if we had enough men, enough bows. They're not gods." Ethelred stared into the embers. "No, they are not," he replied. "But they are the future, and the future wears iron." Cenric turned away. He did not speak of it again. But Ethelred knew the thought would not leave him. It would live in the hearts of many now. A restless fire, waiting for breath. Grimsby was changing, not through destruction, but through possession. Slowly, piece by piece, what had once been Saxon was being named anew. The fields would be taxed by foreign lords. The church would pray in foreign tongues. Even the land, the very bones of England, now lay beneath a new boot. And the folk of Grimsby, like Ethelred, like Edgifu, like Cenric, would have to learn what it meant to live with their faces tilted upward, not in reverence, but in watching. Watching the men on horseback, watching the edge of the forest, watching the road that once brought kings and now brought something colder. Not a conqueror, but a system, one that would not swing swords in rage, but crush slowly, with rules and records and no room for old names. Winter came without ceremony. The first frost coated the fields of Grimsby in late November, turning the last brown blades of grass into brittle ghosts of what they once were. Smoke curled thickly from chimneys, and the people worked harder, faster, quieter, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the strange balance they were now forced to live within. The new order had not yet shown its full teeth, but the villagers knew they would. They had seen enough in recent weeks to learn the shape of fear when it wore a tabard and carried a seal. And then, one morning, it arrived. Not a decree, not a tax collector, but a man, their new lord. He rode into Grimsby at the head of a small escort of Norman knights, flanked by 2 carts loaded with wine casks, chests of tools, and a wooden chair with iron studs that looked more like a throne than something meant for a hall. His name was Raoul d'Evreux, a name that rolled through Saxon ears like a stone down a hill. Hard, fast, unfamiliar. He was not cruel in the overt sense. He did not strike children. He did not burn homes. But he did not smile. And when he spoke, it was in the clipped, elegant syllables of a Frenchman forced to choke out English as if it were vinegar in his throat. "I am now the seigneur of this land," he announced in the churchyard, where the villagers had been ordered to gather. "By the grace of King William and God Almighty." He dismounted slowly, handing his reins to a squire with eyes colder than steel. The villagers watched with wary silence. Ethelred stood among them, wrapped in a patched cloak. His wounds had healed, but his limp had not. Eadgifu stood beside him, her eyes narrowed. Cenric, now nearly a man, kept one hand hidden beneath his tunic where a dagger hung. its hilt wrapped in old cloth to muffle the sound. Lord Raoul paced slowly. He examined faces as if they were items to be weighed and sorted. When he reached the front steps of Osbjorn's long hall, he turned. "I have no interest in your customs," he said plainly. "You will work the land. You will pay the tithe. You will not rebel." A few villagers glanced toward Ethelred, unconsciously. Instinctively, Raoul noticed. "And you," he said, pointing directly at him. "You are the warrior." The words landed not like a compliment, but a summons. Ethelred inclined his head. "I was at Hastings," he said softly. Raoul studied him for a moment. "Then you know what happens to those who defy the new realm." It was not a threat. It was a confirmation. Raoul moved into the hall, where Osbjorn once ruled. The Saxon Thane had vanished shortly after the Normans began their sweep of Sussex. Some said he fled north. Others whispered he had died in a skirmish resisting taxes. Whatever the truth, the seat was empty now. By nightfall, it belonged to Normandy. Raoul set about remaking Grimsburg not with fire, but with ink. He brought clerks who spoke only Latin. They redrew boundary lines of fields, not based on inheritance, but production. Cattle were counted, and barns marked for use by the lord's estate. A term none had heard before, but which they quickly learned meant, not yours anymore. He brought masons who tore down the old watchtower near the river and began building, a stone keep in its place. For defense, he claimed. None asked whose defense. Every Sunday, he insisted that Father Leofwine read a prayer for William Rex Anglorum at the start of Mass. The priest obeyed, but his voice stumbled over the foreign syllables. The folk began to change. Children were told not to speak Saxon when the knights walked near. The old women stopped wearing their brooches with animal shapes, the ones handed down from pagan days, lest someone report them. Folk no longer gathered to sing after harvest. They no longer drank openly outside Osbjorn's hall. Laughter became something reserved for the hearth, behind closed shutters, with one eye on the door. And for Ethelred, the change came with a knock. One evening, as he sat carving a wooden toy goose for Senric's youngest brother, two of Raoul's men arrived. "You are summoned," they said. "To refuse would be to vanish." So he went. He found Raoul seated before a hearth in the newly renamed Maison de Bourg. He was drinking wine from a polished horn, his boots drying near the fire. "You are not a fool," Raoul said without preamble. Ethelred said nothing. "You know this village obeys you more than it obeys me. You know the names they whisper when they need comfort." Still, Ethelred said, "Nothing." Raoul's eyes flickered with amusement. "I will make you reeve then. You will gather taxes, settle quarrels, keep the folk in line. And if I refuse," Raoul leaned back, swirling the wine, "then I find someone less patient. Perhaps your son one day, or I take more than sheep next time." It was not a bargain. It was an oath drawn in iron. Ethelred accepted, not because he wished to serve, but because the alternative was worse. When he left the hall, the sky was dusted with stars, and the wind carried the faint sound of someone sobbing. Grimsburg had not burned, but it had bent, and its roots were groaning under the weight of something heavy and very, very old. Winter deepened, and with it, the burden upon Ethelred's shoulders. His new title, Reeve, sounded noble in the mouths of Raoul's scribes. It was spoken with ceremony, as though it honoured him, but the villagers knew, and Ethelred knew, it was not a reward, it was a harness. He had become the hand that fed the conqueror. Every 7 days, he was required to report to the Maison de Bourg, the old long hall now striped with foreign cloth and warmed by stolen hearths. There, he stood before Raoul's steward, a man named Guyot, who never once smiled, and recited in broken Latin the number of eggs, hides, sacks of barley, and strips of smoked pork collected from his own neighbours. He hated every syllable. But he spoke them, He walked the village with a ledger tucked beneath one arm and a reluctant authority in his step. Folk no longer looked him in the eyes. Some nodded curtly, others turned away. A few mothers clutched their children closer when he passed. It was not hatred he felt from them. It was disappointment, and perhaps something worse. Resignation. Even Edgifu, while still tender, had grown quieter. Her hands lingered less when she brushed dust from his cloak. Her eyes, once bright with worry, had taken on the stillness of someone who had buried too many dreams. Senrik watched him with sharp silence. At 16, he had grown tall, his limbs wiry with the strength of youth and anger. He spent more time, in the woods now, learning to trap, to walk unheard, to climb like a squirrel. He spoke little of what he did beyond the village's edge, but Ethelred saw the fire in his eyes, and it frightened him. "Don't," he warned one evening as they sat by the hearth. "Don't give them a reason to turn your name into an excuse." Senrik did not reply. He did not need to. The lad's eyes had already chosen a side, and it was not the one wearing Norman boots. Midwinter brought new trouble. A pig went missing from Raoul's stockyard, not one of the village's pigs, but one taken as tithe and penned for redistribution. The accusation came swiftly. Guillot summoned Ethelred. "You are responsible," the steward said. "A beast under the king's seal does not vanish without a Saxon finger behind it." "I will find it," Ethelred replied. "You will return it," Guillot corrected, "or provide its equal." He had 3 days. The village buzzed with quiet, dread. Ethelred questioned every household. He examined fences, followed hoofprints through frost-hardened earth, searched the thickets beyond the fields. No signs, no answers. But on the second evening, as he returned home with snow clinging to his boots, he found Senrik in the back corner of the barn, tending the fire unusually early, and behind him, wrapped in cloth and soot-smudged, lay the missing pig, its legs bound, its snout muzzled with leather. Ethelred stared at it, then at his son. Senrik did not look away. "I meant to kill it," he said. "Not for food, for a message." Ethelred said nothing for a long while. The fire cracked. Finally, he sat down beside the boy. "You would have brought them on us all," he said. Senrik's voice was quiet, trembling with held-in rage. "They take everything. They take and pretend it's law. And so you steal? They call it law. I call it theft in a finer cloak." Ethelred's hand rose, then fell back. He could not strike him, not for feeling what he too had felt, but he could not allow it either. In the morning, he returned the pig. He told Guillot it had wandered into the old peat marsh by mistake. The steward gave him a long, unreadable look. No punishment followed. But from that day onward, a Norman patrol made a daily circuit around Grimsbur's outer fields. The message was clear: we are watching, and we will not always wait for an excuse. Tensions grew. Disputes broke out among the villagers, over tools, over firewood, over whispered suspicions of who might be talking too freely to the new masters. Once, Ethelred was called to settle a quarrel between 2 brothers over an ox taken in payment for taxes. He ruled in favour of the younger, whose wife had just given birth. The elder stormed off, muttering curses. The next week, someone scratched the word traitor into Ethelred's door. He did not remove it. He left it there for all to see, for himself too. Raoul summoned him not long after. The lord sat in the great chair of the long hall, a black hound curled at his feet. He offered no greeting. "You rule softly," he said. "I rule to keep the peace," Ethelred replied. Raoul sipped his wine. "The peace belongs to me." Ethelred met his gaze. "No," he said quietly. "It belongs to the folk who live in its silence." Raoul smiled faintly. "We shall see how long it lasts." When Ethelred left the hall that evening, the snow had begun to fall again, gentle as breath, covering the village in a white so pure it hurt to look at. But beneath it, the The soil remembered everything, and it waited. The winter in Grimsby settled like a second skin, cold, clinging, and unrelenting. Snow covered every rooftop in soft white silence, muffling the sounds of daily life until even the hammer on the anvil seemed to strike softer. Beneath the stillness, beneath the frost, something ancient and uneasy began to stir. No one could say precisely when it started. Perhaps it was not a moment, but the accumulation of many small ones. The shuttered church, the locked food stores, the absence of song in the mead hall. Perhaps it was the absence of Father Leofwine's warm voice on a Sunday morning, replaced now by the brittle drone of a Norman clerk reciting a prayer in Latin none could understand, much less feel. But in Ethelred's bones, it was the bell that had not rung since Epiphany, the bell that, for generations, had been the voice of the village, calling the lost, warning of fire, marking time, announcing joy and death alike. And now, it was silent. One morning, Ethelred stood in the snow, looking up at the chapel tower. The door was nailed, shut, the wood darkened by sleet. Ice had formed at the base, creeping up like vines trying to reclaim what was theirs. He remembered his wedding day when Eadgifu's laughter had filled this same yard. He remembered the spring Cenric was born, and how the bell had rung for him like a shout of hope. And he remembered the last sermon Leofwine had given, the one where he spoke not of kings, but of conscience. And then, without planning it, Ethelred placed one hand against the chapel door. It was cold, as expected, but the silence it held was colder still. Inside, Father Leofwine remained under a kind of house arrest, permitted food, warmth and the word of God, but denied the flock he'd shepherded since youth. Ethelred had tried once to speak with him, but a Norman soldier barred the door, mouth curled in boredom. That was when the whispers began. Not loud, not rash, just small flickers in dark corners, hushed names, bitter prayers. Someone had scratched the old rune for justice into the bark of a tree near the granary. Someone else had left a sprig of holly on the chapel step, an ancient symbol from the time before priests. They were not open acts of rebellion, they were acts of remembering. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and pale in the sky, Cenric found his father outside the barn, sharpening a small hand axe against a stone. "I've spoken with Osred," he said, voice low. Ethelred paused, the scrape of stone falling silent. "He says we have enough to burn the storehouse if we strike just after nightfall." Ethelred's jaw tensed. The storehouse is watched. Only till midnight. A long silence stretched between them. Cenric stepped closer, his breath forming slow clouds in the cold. "They took Leofwine's voice," he said. "They took the bell. Next, they'll take the fire from our hearths and call it justice." Ethelred stared at the axe in his hand, then slowly set it down. "I know," he said. "You always said to wait, to watch. But how long, father?" Ethelred looked up at his son, really looked at him. Cenric's eyes were no longer the eyes of a boy. They were hard and clear, like river stone after thaw. "I waited because I feared what fire brings," he said. "Not the burning itself, but what it leaves behind." Cenric clenched his jaw. "And what has patience left us?" Ethelred did not answer. That night, the wind changed. It came down from the northern hills, heavy with the scent of pine and soot. Snow still blanketed the thatched roofs, but beneath it, the world was cracking. The people of Grimsby ate their meals in silence. The children were quieter than usual. Even the animals in the barns seemed restless. Near midnight, the bell rang. Once, clear loud. No one had seen who climbed the chapel ladder. No one spoke of it afterward. But the sound echoed over the village like a forgotten vow spoken aloud. It stirred something in the bones of every man and woman. It stirred Raoul too. He sent riders at once to investigate. They found no footprints, no lantern, nothing but the still swinging rope and the impression of a boot on the bell tower's wooden floor. A warning. 2 days later, a fire broke out in the grain store. It burned fast, unnaturally so. The snow slowed its spread, but not before half the season's tithe was destroyed. By dawn, blackened beams reached like ribs toward the sky, and the air stank of ash and oil. Raoul's fury was precise. He did not kill, he did not lash. He summoned Ethelred. They met in the stone-walled keep, where a fire burned too high and too bright for comfort. "You'll find who did this," Raoul said, "or I'll take tenfold from the village." Ethelred stood motionless. "You know I cannot," he replied. Raoul stepped closer. "Then perhaps it was you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. "If it were," Ethelred said slowly, "you'd already be burning too." Raoul's eyes narrowed, but he did not strike. Instead, he turned back to the fire. "This land will learn to kneel," he murmured. Ethelred turned and left, the words following him like wolves. The next evening, someone laid a handful of barley, grains on the chapel step, blackened, burnt, and still warm. A message, not of rebellion, but of remembrance. And the bell did not ring again that week, but its echo lived on, in every glance, in every oath unspoken, in every fire that burned slow beneath the frost. Spring came to Grimsby, not with joy, but with soft hesitation. The snow retreated first from the hilltops, then from the fields, curling back like a tired beast. Green shoots emerged from the mud with caution, as if the world itself wasn't sure whether it was safe to grow again. But the keep did not move. Its new stone walls, rough and grey, loomed high above the thatched roofs of the village. It was not yet finished. Workmen still hauled timber and mortar to the upper levels. But it cast a long shadow that stretched farther each day. That shadow now touched the church, the green, the eastern pastures. And in the quiet hours of dusk, it reached Ethelred's own door. He felt it most in the mornings when he walked the paths of his reeveship. Where once neighbours would wave or offer him a nod, now he met only the dull silence of submission. The folk had grown quieter, slower, to speak, quicker, to retreat behind closed doors. He could not blame them. The memory of the fire still hung over the village. The blackened stones of the old granary had been cleared away, and a new one had been built by Norman masons, stronger, higher, and bearing a carved emblem none of them recognized, a boar's head surrounded by a ring of iron thorns. Raoul's symbol. It was everywhere now, etched into beams, pressed into wax seals, stitched onto the cloaks of his men. He claimed it was a sign of protection. To the villagers, it was a mark of ownership. Ethelred spent his days balancing scales that could not be levelled. He oversaw land disputes, enforced tax collections, and listened to petty grievances. Yet, every decision he made was passed through Raoul's steward, Guyot, a pale man with ink-stained fingers and a voice like dry parchment. "You serve the king now," Guyot reminded him once, when Ethelred had argued for leniency toward a family, short on their winter tithe. "Mercy is not ours to offer." That night, Ethelred sat long by the fire, his hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold. Edgifu joined him, her movements slower than they once were. She had aged more in the last year than in the 10 before it. Lines had crept into the corners of her mouth. Her voice, once melodic with quiet laughter, had taken on the hush of a woman who measured each word for safety. "You carry too much," Yurushi said softly. "I carry what is left," he replied. Senrik was not home. He had begun disappearing for days at a time, returning with wild eyes and muddy boots, his stories vague, his excuses thinner with each telling. Ethelred did not press. He knew the shape of restless youth. He had once worn it himself. But when Senrik spoke of the old stories, of Hereward the Wake in the Fens, of outlaws in Sherwood, of men who resisted with steel and shadow, Ethelred felt something cold wrap around his heart. He wanted to believe, but belief had become a luxury. The keep rose higher. Its walls were now topped with crenellations, and, from them, the red and gold banners of Normandy flapped in the wind. There was talk of a garrison being stationed there permanently. Raoul had written to court requesting additional arms for the stability of Sussex. What he meant, Ethelred knew, was control. And yet, life continued. The fields were sown, the lambs were born. Weddings still happened, though without feasts, and death, as ever, came in its due season. One such death stirred something deeper. Winflade, the oldest woman in the village, passed away in her sleep. She had seen 3 kings reign. Her memory held songs no one else remembered, stories older than the cathedral stones. Her cottage smelled of sage and smoke, and her hands had spun wool for nearly every household. When news of her death spread, something strange occurred. The village gathered, not out of obligation, but instinct. No bell rang. No order was given. They came in silence, dressed in black, walking in 2s and 3s, bringing herbs and candles and bundles of dried flowers. Raoul forbade large assemblies, but no one stopped. Ethelred led the procession, not as reeve, not as agent of the Normans, but as one of them. They buried Winflade at the edge of the old grove, beneath an ancient ash tree. No cross marked the grave, only a smooth stone, and on it, Cynric had carved a simple word in runes. Remember, Raoul heard of it later. He summoned Ethelred the next morning. "Why no cross?" he asked. "She was too old for your god," Ethelred replied, not unkindly. Raoul narrowed his eyes. "I allow your ways, but I will not tolerate sedition disguised as sentiment." "She was a thread," Ethelred said quietly, "and now the tapestry is weaker." Raoul said nothing more. But the next week, a Norman priest arrived to serve the church beside Leofwine. His name was Father Etienne. He did not speak English, but he spoke often. The services grew longer, the candles brighter, the Latin louder. Cynric refused to attend. Others followed, one by one. Ethelred watched it all from the edge, from the longhouse, from the boundary between 2 eras. He was neither outlaw nor loyalist, neither master nor servant. He was what the Normans could not understand, a root that refused to break, even when the tree above had fallen. And though the keep cast its shadow long, there were still places it could not reach. A bend in the stream where children whispered old songs, a hollow in the woods where stones were stacked in quiet prayer, a field where barley grew in defiance, as it always had. Memory faded, yes, but some things sank deeper, and, in the hearts of the people of Grimsby, the roots of England held, silent, patient, waiting. The village of Grimsby breathed, but only just. It was a late summer afternoon, and the air carried the scent of crushed barley and distant smoke. Fields swayed with life, though fewer hands worked them now. Many of the strongest had left, vanished, into the forests, or conscripted for Norman levies, or simply disappeared without farewell. The rest remained like roots in stony earth, tough, silent, and tangled too deeply to pull. The keep towered above it all. It had been finished that spring. Its battlements stood like jagged teeth on the landscape, an ugly crown on the hill where Saxon longhalls once stood. The chapel now held 2 altars, one for Latin, one for silence. The village no longer resisted openly, but it remembered. And remembrance, as Ethelred had come to understand, was its own kind of sword. He had long since ceased wearing the Reeve's token of office, though he continued to fulfill the role. Raoul no longer asked for his counsel. The steward, Gaio, dealt now with the Norman quartermasters and the records sent to Winchester. Ethelred, for his part, spoke less and listened more. It was listening that had saved him, and now it was listening that would help something stir. Cynric returned one evening after 3 days away, his face streaked with mud and eyes alive with the fire of something Ethelred had both feared and hoped for. "They're real," he whispered, over bread and stew. "The men in the woods, the old banners. They remember the white horse, father." Ethelred said nothing at first. He poured water. He tore bread. He waited. Cenric leaned forward. "They meet near the oak at Wolf's Hollow. There were 12 of them this time. Men from farther south. They speak of Edric's name, of rebellion." Ethelred finally raised his eyes. "And what do they ask?" "Not for arms," Cenric said. "Not yet. Just ears. Just a sign that we are still watching." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small carved token, a disc of ash wood etched with the ancient Saxon symbol for standfast, a coiled serpent biting its tail. Ethelred held it in his palm. It was smooth, hand-worn, alive with memory. "Say," said you were known, Cenric added. "They spoke your name with respect, not as a leader, as something older, as witness." Ethelred closed his fingers over the token. He remembered Hastings. He remembered the cold morning after the battle. He remembered burying Wulfstan with bare hands, too numb to cry. He had lived to carry the memory forward, and now it asked him to do more. In the days that followed, small changes came to Grimsburg. The forge was used more often at night. Fewer sheep were reported in the spring census than were actually born. A certain path behind the chapel was swept clean each dawn, though none ever saw who walked it. Symbols reappeared, drawn lightly in ash, carved into the underside of cartwheels, etched into bread before baking, not loud, not reckless, just present. The Norman guards noticed little, or perhaps they noticed but did not understand. Raoul grew more distant. He no longer held court in the village, preferring his chambers in the keep. The local taxes were collected by men Ethelred did not recognize. Newcomers from the coast, hard-eyed and quiet. There were whispers that William himself had ordered the land to be surveyed in full, and then came the men with ink and horses. The Domesday surveyors. They moved from manor to manor, from shire to shire, writing down everything, every pig, every acre, every peasant, every stream and mill and field. They asked questions with smiles and recorded answers with cold detachment. When they came to Grimsburg, they spent 3 days asking the same things in different ways. Ethelred stood by as they wrote. He watched as they wrote that his house, once marked as freehold, now belonged to the crown, that his name was not that of a landholder, but of a villain, that the village itself had no thegn, no priest, no charter, just names and numbers and silence. Later, when they had gone, he sat beside the old ash tree where Winflaed had been buried. Cenric came to him at dusk. "They make records, of all things," the boy said, "but not of what matters," Ethelred replied. That night, they buried the token of Standfast beside the grave, not to hide it, to plant it. 2 weeks later, a Norman soldier vanished. One of the younger ones, prone to boasting and drink. He had last been seen near the chapel, walking alone. His horse returned without him. Raoul ordered a search. The village was questioned. Ethelred gave no answers. Raoul said little, but he doubled the watches. And on the chapel step the next morning, someone placed a single white feather soaked in wine and bound with twine. A message, old as firelight, new as breath. The rebellion had not begun, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of waiting. And when it broke, it would break all. At once, the discovery came at dawn. A Norman guard was found slumped beneath the west wall of the keep, his throat opened cleanly, as if by a blade honed with intent. No struggle, no sound in the night, just a widening pool of blood, half frozen in the coolness of the late summer morning. Beside the body lay a white feather, its tip stained red. Raoul was awakened within the hour. His chamber doors were flung open by an officer with no words left for subtlety. The Norman lord emerged wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, boots unlaced, eyes shadowed with more than sleep. Ethelred saw him from the green, where villagers had already begun to gather, not in panic, but in tension. A murmuring wind of suspicion circled them. Men and women huddled with arms crossed, their voices hushed as snow. No one asked who had done it. No one needed to. It was not confession they feared. It was consequence. Raoul stood over the body for a long time. His face did not betray anger, but something colder. Not fury, but calculation. He turned to Guillaume, the steward, questioned them all. Even the children? Especially the children. By midday, the village had become a net. Guards roamed, from door to door, questioning each household, turning over tools and opening barns. No one resisted. They had learned the price of open defiance, but their silence was louder than any cry of innocence. Ethelred was summoned as the sun passed its highest arc. He found Raoul seated on the outer wall, his feet dangling slightly over the edge, as though he were contemplating whether to fall or to rise. "You know what this means," Raoul said without looking at him. "It means someone fought back," Ethelred replied. Raoul gave a bitter laugh. "That's not what I asked." He turned then, his eyes searching Ethelred's face. "You know who did this?" Ethelred did not answer. "You may not have held the blade," Raoul continued, "but someone followed your example. You built a myth here, Reeve, a myth that Saxons can outlast kings." Ethelred's voice was quiet. "And can they not?" Raoul stood abruptly. "No, not if I break the line." A moment passed between them, silent and taut. "What will you do?" Ethelred asked. "I will make this village remember what it fears." That evening, Raoul gathered the villagers. He stood in the centre of the green, flanked by guards in full mail. A gallows had been hastily erected. New wood, fresh rope. "This crime," he began, "cannot go unanswered." The villagers watched, silent. "I asked for a name. You gave me none. I asked for truth. You gave me riddles, so now I give you justice." From behind the keep's gate, a prisoner was dragged forth, Cynric. His hair was matted with blood, his tunic torn, one eye already swelling shut. Yet he walked on his own feet, his head unbowed. Ethelred stepped forward. "This is false." Raoul turned slowly. He was seen. "By whom?" "By those whose word I value more than yours." Cynric stood now beneath the gallows. He did not look at Raoul. He looked only at his father. There was no fear in his face, only one question. "Will you let me die alone?" Ethelred took a step forward. Raoul raised a hand. "If you defy this—" "I do not defy you," Ethelred said. "I stand for what you have already broken." He walked toward his son, and without another word, he placed his hands upon the rope and cut it down. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The guards tensed, weapons raised. But Raoul did not give the order. Not yet. Instead, he looked at Ethelred with a strange expression, half rage, half recognition. "You invite war," he said. "No," Ethelred replied. "You brought it. I'm only naming it." That night the village changed. Cynric was hidden. The gallows dismantled. The guards, though doubled, no longer walked alone. Even the chapel bell was silenced, this time by the priest himself. Father Leofwine knelt in the sanctuary and refused to leave until his people were safe. Raoul, for his part, did not strike again. Not immediately. He waited. And in that waiting, the village breathed again. Ethelred sat by the hearth with his son, binding his wounds with steady hands. "You should have let them hang me," Cynric muttered. "I should have," Ethelred said. "But I will not bury my son for a lie." Cynric's fingers closed around the same token he had once brought home. A a coiled serpent. We are more than they think, he whispered. Ethelred nodded. But we must be wiser than they fear. From that night on, things moved quickly. More feathers appeared, on doors, on windowsills, in water troughs, quiet signs, shared signals. A message passed through shadow and silence. We are not done. We are not broken. The rebellion had not yet risen, but its heart had begun to beat. And in Grimsby, that beat echoed beneath every footfall. There were no more open trials in Grimsby, no more gallows, no more questions. Raoul had discovered that fear had its limits, and beyond those limits lay defiance, not born of courage, but of necessity. He withdrew his patrols from the inner village. Guards stayed near the keep. The tax collector came under heavier escort, but outside the village boundaries, beyond the hedgerows and forest paths, something new stirred, or rather, something old returned. It began with whispers from Wolf's hollow. A hunter spotted torches in the mist. A shepherd found meat left on a stump. Roasted boar, still warm, wrapped in cloth with a Saxon rune carved on the bone. And one morning, 3 horses stolen from Norman stables were discovered tied to a tree near the stream, stripped of saddles facing south. Cenric knew what it meant. He told his father over supper, eyes bright, voice steady. They're not just hiding anymore. Ethelred nodded slowly. They're watching, Cenric added. That night, they left the house by moonlight, not in flight. In answer, the path to Wolf's Hollow wound deep through the thickets of Grimsby's northern wood. It was a place long whispered to be cursed, a haunt of spirits, and the site of an old barrow where bones were buried in stone chambers. But now it was something more. By the time Ethelred and Cenric reached it, the torches were already lit. 7. Men stood in the clearing. 4 wore cloaks made of wolf hide. 2 had bows slung across their backs. The last, a tall, bare-headed man with greying hair, stepped forward. Ethelred of Grimsby, he said. You kept the name. I kept the truth, Ethelred replied. The man nodded. I am Osric, once of Gillingham, now of nowhere. Cenric recognized the name, Osric the Freeman. He had been among the Saxon leaders who refused to bend the knee after the conquest. His homestead was burned, his sons taken. He vanished years ago, thought dead or broken, but here he stood, alive and not alone. We are not many, Osric said, but we are enough to wound. He gestured around the hollow. There are camps in the woods beyond the downs, others to the west, near Chichester. Some say Harewood lives still, others follow Morcar. The north is quiet, but not asleep. Ethelred studied him carefully. And what do you want of us? Osric didn't hesitate. Truth, shelter, names, and when the time is right, steel. Cenric stepped forward. I'm ready now. Ethelred laid a hand on his son's shoulder. Not yet, he said gently. Let fire learn where the wind blows before it's fanned. Osric nodded. Wise. They stayed the night in the hollow. No fires, only embers. The men spoke of raids, not grand attacks but small jabs. Food stolen from convoys, messages intercepted, spies placed in Norman households. Each act a needle, not a sword. By morning, Ethelred had made a decision. We will not raise banners, he said. Grimsby must appear loyal, Osric agreed. If it becomes known, they will salt your fields. But, Ethelred continued, we will listen, and we will carry. That spring, Grimsby changed once more, not outwardly. The chapel still rang with Latin. The steward still wrote names and numbers. Raoul still passed on horseback, his cloak trailing like a storm behind him. But underneath, beneath every thatched roof, in every tool shed, under every floorboard, there were signs. A blade hidden in a bread bin, a bow wrapped in sheep's wool beneath a crib, messages etched in charcoal behind water barrels. The children were taught again, not reading and writing, but silence. the way to nod without seeming to, how to walk without leaving prints, how to look past a man without letting him know you saw his face, and most of all, who to trust. Trust, it turned out, was the rarest coin of all. Cynric became a runner. He carried word between Grimsby and the Hollows. Sometimes he vanished for days. When he returned, his eyes told more than his tongue. One day, he brought news. There was a raid on the road to Arundel. Norman supplies, burned to ash. They left a feather behind. Ethelred felt something stir in his chest. It was not pride. It was not vengeance. It was a tremor of belonging. That night, at the edge of the village, 3 villagers gathered in secret. A blacksmith, a shepherd, and an old widow whose husband had died in Hastings. They brought with them no weapons, only a cup of mead, a strip of cloth, and a handful of barley seeds, a small ritual, a quiet vow. They planted the seeds beneath the ash tree and whispered one word: endure. Father Leofwine, though still guarded by Etienne in the chapel, began to preach differently. He spoke of the Old Testament, of Babylon, of Daniel, of quiet survival in a foreign land. He said, "There is strength in stillness, but stillness must not mean surrender." The people listened. Raoul, for all his suspicions, seemed unaware of the deeper change. Or perhaps he knew and waited to see if it would bloom into open fire. But Grimsby had learned. Fire did not begin with flame. It began with the breath drawn before the spark. And in the hollows of Sussex, that breath was being held. Ready, waiting. Late summer came with heavy skies. Clouds pressed low over Grimsby, thick with the promise of rain that never quite arrived. The air was humid, oppressive, as though the land itself were holding its breath. It was in that breathless hush that something snapped. The villagers had become accustomed to quiet defiance, to whispers in the hedgerows, to silent signals and unspoken loyalties. But there was an unease now, an itch at the edges of every gesture. Men glanced over shoulders. Women lingered by doorways longer than necessary. Even the children had begun to sense it, that somewhere in their midst, something had shifted. Ethelred felt it like a stone in his chest. The balance was breaking, and then the fire came. It happened just after dusk. The barn at the edge of the village, the one closest to the forest trail, erupted in flame. Orange light bled through the night, casting flickering shadows against the cottages. Smoke clawed skyward, thick and choking. Villagers rushed to form a chain of buckets, but it was too late. By the time they doused the last smouldering beam, only blackened timbers remained. The hay was gone, the tools gone, and something else too. Beneath the ash, Ethelred found the stone that had marked the old hollow where messages were left, split in 2, deliberately, and nailed to the charred frame of the barn's doorway. A feather, black as pitch. No one spoke it aloud, but all knew what it meant. The enemy was no longer only outside. Someone among them had turned. Cynric was among the first to suspect. His eyes burned with anger as he stood before the ruin. They knew. Whoever lit this, they knew where to strike. Ethelred said nothing, but his fists were clenched at his sides. The days that followed were laced with suspicion. Neighbours once trusted now regarded one another with wary silence. A cough behind a door might be a signal. A missing hen. A message. Even small kindnesses were questioned. Was this bread given freely or to earn trust? Was this greeting warm or watched? And into that poisoned air came a stranger. He called himself Sir Gilbert. A knight, though he bore no armour. A Norman, though he claimed no land. He arrived with a smile and a travel-worn horse, asking after herbs, bread, the price of wool. He shared wine with the blacksmith. He prayed in Latin with Father Etienne. But beneath the smiles he listened. He asked questions. Not directly, never forcefully, but always circling, like a hawk above a field. Where does your sun go at night? Do you know who tends the southern path? Has Ethelred taken a new ledger? Small questions, deadly in their shape. By the third day, Ethelred received a summons. Raoul stood by the hearth in the great hall, arms folded. "We've been patient," he said, "more patient than most." Gilbert sat beside him, one leg crossed, sipping mead. "And what has patience earned us?" Raoul asked. Gilbert answered before Ethelred could speak. "Deceit, hidden weapons, and names spoken only in shadow." Laid a parchment on the table. A list. Names in Norman script. Senric dot Wilstan. Father Leofwine, and one more. Munda Ethelred's eyes narrowed. Munda was no fighter. She was a widow, soft-voiced, grey-haired, known for weaving warm cloaks for winter and singing the lullabies of her childhood. Gilbert leaned forward. "She's the key. Messages passed in bread, tokens sewn into hems, and more than once seen walking alone to the ash tree." Ethelred said, "That's not proof. That's presumption." Raoul stepped forward. "It's enough." That evening, they came for her. No trial, no sermon, just steel and chains. The villagers watched in silence as Munda was led through the green. Her head was high. She walked with the calm of one who had already made peace with the worst the world could offer. Ethelred stood before her, eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I already have," she replied. "In the thread of every cloak, in every warm loaf. I said it 100 times. We are not gone." She placed something in his hand, a small cloth pouch. "For the next winter," she whispered. At sunrise, she was hanged from the old tree where the village once crowned its harvest queen. No morning bell rang. The rope creaked once, then fell still, and just like that, the silence cracked. The village buried her beneath the ash tree. No priest, no Latin, only a single stone carved by Senric's trembling hand. It read, "For the fire that did not die." Later that night, Ethelred opened the pouch she had given him. Inside, 3 white feathers, a sprig of dried thyme, and a folded scrap of linen stitched with the rune for endure. She had known. Long before Gilbert arrived, long before the barn was burned, Munda had known what path she walked, and she had chosen it anyway. The days that followed were sharper, tighter, as though all of Grimsby had begun to breathe in unison, not in panic, but in preparation. There was no more guessing. There would be more betrayals, more names, more nooses. But now the people understood. The cost was known, and still they did not break. Ethelred kept the pouch beside the hearth, and each morning, before the sun rose, he whispered Munda's name, because a flame, once given a name, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a beacon. By the time the first frost settled on Grimsby's thatched roofs, there were fewer voices in the square and more candles in the windows. The world was quieter, but it was not still. Beneath that hush lay something ancient, not rebellion, not grief, resilience. The kind that grew where songs were once sung, and now only silence remained. Raoul, lord of the keep, rarely left its stone walls now. His face, once proud and confident, bore the look of a man who had inherited land but never earned it. His patrols had thinned. His messengers passed through the village with hurried steps and wary glances. Even Sir Gilbert had departed, summoned north perhaps, or simply sent away when his parchment and suspicions yielded nothing but ghost trails and empty glances. For Grimsby had mastered the art of nothing. They gave no names. They lit no fires. That did not cook food or warm children, and yet they carried secrets in every movement. The white feathers still appeared, rare now, subtle, placed only in the safest hands. Messages whispered across counties told of villages waking, one by one, to the truth that they were not alone. Across the downs, in the quiet woods and wild marshes, Saxon spirits still lingered like mist at dawn. But here, at the heart of it, where ash met stone and memory met blood, Ethelred watched over his people. He no longer needed to speak. His presence alone was enough. At the edge of the village, green stood the ash tree. Munda's stone lay beneath it, weather-worn now but still clear. Children played nearby, never loudly, but freely. Sometimes they'd pause, touch the stone as they passed, and whisper the word they'd learned to carry like a seed. Remember, Idgifu sat by the hearth that winter, spinning wool with a rhythm steady as prayer. Her hands moved instinctively, muscle and memory united, thread by thread. She hummed now and then, quiet tunes that had no words, but carried the weight of lullabies long forgotten. "You hear it too, don't you?" she asked one evening, as Ethelred returned from a round. Through the fields, he removed his cloak, shook off the frost and sat beside her. "Hear what?" "The change, like something waiting beneath the snow." He nodded. "They say the Danes stir again," he said quietly. "Not armies, not yet, but ships and ears." "And the king?" He tightens his grip. "But even a hand can bleed if it clenches too long." They shared a look. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the shutters. Senric came home that same night, carrying not just mud and the smell of pine, but something else. Hope. "They've taken 2 supply trains near Winchester," he said. "Left nothing behind but feathers and frost." Ethelred smiled faintly. Senric warmed his hands by the fire, gazing into the dancing light. "It's not about winning anymore, is it?" His father looked up. "No, it never was." "Then what?" "It's about not vanishing." And that was what Grimsby had become. Not a rebel's den, not a battlefield, but a quiet defiance. The Saxon soul made visible not in weapons, but in customs, kept alive. In songs hummed over stew, in the shape of the bread, and the way an old rune found its way into a child's carved toy. One morning, the Domesday men returned. This time, they asked no questions. They simply walked the fields, wrote in silence, nodded without expression. When they left, Ethelred found a copy of their record at the chapel door. Grimsby, 37 households, 2 mills, no freemen. Land granted to Norman, authority, loyal, quiet, obedient. He folded the page, placed it beside the hearth, and said nothing, because the truth could not be written in ledgers. It lived in other places, in the bruised knuckles of a boy who had carried messages too far, in the songs old women taught to children, whose mouths still tasted Latin, but whose hearts remembered English, in the way the people planted barley not just for food, but because it had grown here before William ever landed. It was that winter, too, that a strange rider came to the edge of Grimsby. Cloaked in grey, face shadowed beneath a deep hood, he did not enter the village. He waited at the marker stone. When Ethelred approached, the man bowed low. "You are remembered," he said. "And you are?" Ethelred asked. "A man from Mercia, from one of many places where the root remains." He handed Ethelred a small scroll and turned without another word, disappearing into the trees. That night, by firelight, Ethelred read the message. No names, no plans, just a phrase. "Spring will come. Be the thaw." He burned the scroll. But the words stayed, and when spring finally crept back into the land, soft and patient, Grimsby bloomed not in flowers, but in knowing. The keep still stood, the taxes still came, the chapel still sang in foreign tones, but beneath it all, England whispered, and that whisper carried, down through roots, across water, into hills, and into hearts, because in the end, the Normans had conquered castles and crowned their king. But they had not conquered memory, not the memory of the fallen, not the memory of how it felt to walk as a free Saxon, not the memory of the ash tree's shadow, and certainly not the memory of a village that chose to endure. Grimsby would never make the history books. It would not be etched on a king's tomb. But in the firelit hush of twilight, when the wind passed through its quiet lanes and stirred the long grass, you could still hear them, the whispers, the names, the oaths, and the truth, older than any conqueror, that the root remained and always would.